slowly coming in from the waiting room. Before we sort of officially do the welcome and all of those things, just a couple of simple housekeeping things. The first one is that we are recording this. If I hope that everyone is comfortable with it being recorded. But just be mindful that it's being recorded. It will just be the person who's speaking who will appear on the recording. But if, for extra caution, if you'd like to have your screen off, etc., please let us know or opt out. Likewise, there is a Q&A. If you'd like to ask questions as we're going, feel free to type those into the chat, and we will be fielding those questions toward the end. There's going to be a brief presentation followed by hopefully lively discussion. And with that, I will hand over to Angie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to what hopefully will be a very fruitful series of Salon Series with the Searls. The Ostrom Workshop is proud to announce that we're working with this initiative with the Searls in many different areas, but I've been asked to give a little bit of a background of the workshop and promise not to take too much time. The workshop is actually funded through the Nobel Prize that Elinor Ostrom received. And at that time, they were working on community-based governance, as well as, which some of you may recognize as what we call the IAD framework, but also mostly natural resource governance, and a lot of what Vincent called polycentric governance, which is multiple nodes of authority who make decision-making in overlapping zones. So the combination of these two earned Elinor Ostrom a Nobel Prize, in which he used to fund the Ostrom Workshop. We're here in Bloomington on a rainy day, quite honestly, and everything that Ostrom is doing right now, for the most part, is on Zoom, which has allowed us actually, in terms of a lot of these Salon Series and working groups, to actually engage a much larger portion of the globe, quite honestly. And I can very quickly see today that that's what's happened. So thank you all for being here. I'm the Director of Data Management and Information Governance, but we host multiple programs here, from natural resource governance to the political economy to internet and cybersecurity, as well as one of our newest programs called Simply the Commons, which we all do, of course, work in as well. So this series, which Isak is going to introduce to you in a second, is one of the newest initiatives that the data management program is undertaking to ask us to consider better ways, quite frankly, that we could govern this space in real time. So I'm going to turn it over to Isak, but again, thank you for being here. If you're interested, I will eventually, when I'm not answering all these Q&As, post the link to the Ostrom Workshop, and we would love if you signed up for either one of our listservs with no requirement other than getting tons of emails from us, quite frankly, or as one of our affiliates, and all of those things will get you active in our community should you want to. And with that, I'll turn it over to Isak.
Thank you, Angie. Well, with no further ado, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Doc and Joyce Searls, as well as David P. Reed. And many of you know them already, but for those who do not, Doc Searls is a veteran journalist and author called by Thomas L. Friedman of the New York Times one of the most respected technology writers in America. He's best known as the co-author of the landmark Clue Train Manifesto, and he's also the author of The Intention Economy, When Customers Take Charge. Which describes the work that he began in 2006 as a fellow with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and which continues today as Project VRM, which fosters development of tools that increase personal agency in the digital world. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about this today. But he's also a fellow with the Center for Information Technology and Society at UC Santa Barbara, and a visiting scholar with the Ostrom Workshop here at Indiana University. He's a frequent keynote speaker at conferences. Doc also co-organizes the Internet Identity Workshop twice yearly at the Computer History Museum, and hosts the podcast Floss weekly for the Twit network. Joyce Searls is a serial entrepreneur whose business, management, and marketing instincts have been successfully applied across diverse industries, including apparel, hospitality, real estate, and technology. In 1994, following 25 years as a fashion industry professional, Joyce co-founded the Searls Group with her husband, Doc Searls. Joyce and Doc are founders of the nonprofit Customer Commons, whose mission is to balance digital power between individuals and the entities that serve them. She joins Doc today at the lecture. Finally, they're both joined by David P. Reed. David is an American computer scientist who was educated at MIT, who's known for a number of significant contributions to computer networking and wireless communication network. Amongst other things, he was involved in the early development of TCP, and was the designer of the user datagram protocol of UDP, though he finds this title a little embarrassing, is what I'm told. So with that, please join me in welcoming our three incredible guest speakers, and of course also, is the founder of Reed's Law, right? So very, very important thing not to overlook. I was told to be brief, so I hand over to the three of you. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take it from here. I noticed in the chat that Reed's Law with an exclamation mark is brought up by Drummond Reed, no relation, as far as I know. But the coincidence is too hard to ignore. I'm going to do the share screen thing here and get this started. And in the middle of this, I'll break it off and give it to David. But let me start with the share screen thing. Here we go. Nope, it's starting on the wrong slide. Why is it starting on the wrong slide? There we go. Take two. Share screen. And I'm sure Zoom will make this smoother in the fullness of time. Okay, so the title of both this talk and this series, this Salon series, is Beyond the Web. And in the credits that Isak ran earlier, he mentioned all these good things about David. There are many people who are called the father or the parents of the web or the internet rather. I think you can establish parentage by imagining what the internet would be like without them. If you take me away from the internet, it has changed 0.00001 of whatever is there. You take David away, and it's very, very different. And I can illustrate that to some degree with this first slide. Paul Barron, who is a lot older than either of us and gone now, but Paul in the early 1960s worked for the Rand Corporation, and at the time a problem to be worked out was how to make networking better, less vulnerable, all kinds of things, and he posited that if you take the same set of dots representing endpoints and you can look at the way networking was done at the time, all of it was centralized. That was the design of a network back then. You had a big computer in the middle, and you had a bunch of terminals out at the edges of it, out at the ends of it, and that was the way it was done. And then he said, well, you could also decentralize, which is where you have a central one, but you have all these other ones that are out there. And then considered the big innovation at the time was distributed, which is basically a lot of people say that is actually what we got with the internet. He designed the model for the way the internet became in the long run, and distributed that is in the sense that you scatter them all over the place, not that one central point hosts them in any way. So, and I took that same drawing and I just took away all the lines and put a fourth one here called independent, because I think this is what we actually have with the internet. We're not all constantly hooked up to everybody. We're actually independent. We're an end. All these ends are independent. And that design, that model there, is what David and his colleagues described in a landmark paper called The End-to-End Principle in Systems Design, which David Weinberger, who's a co-author with me of World of Ends, of the Clutre Manifesto, called World of Ends. We live in a world of ends. That came out in 2003, and it's still on the net because the web, because we still pay for it. But this is what companies actually want. It's what organizations want. And of course, organizations are organized this way. And this is what we got really with the web. The web is not the thing we see on the right. It's kind of superimposed on the thing we have on the right. But this is what the internet, and I have to move my little thing, what the internet still is. In other words, the web is on top of the net. The web is not the net itself, and they shouldn't be confused. So let me get back on there. Okay. What that's given us, this world of ends, of nothing but ends, is really new to human experience. And one big difference between our physical lives on terra firma and where we are now is there's no gravity here and there's no distance, which are insights that Joyce came up with a few years ago. And if you look at it in terms of the English language, at least, we have prepositions to tell us where we are. We have over, under, around, through, beside, within, alongside, above. All of those indicate position, but we're all with each other. We're not really on the internet. The internet, data goes through the internet, but one of the graces of the end-to-end principle is it's agnostic to how the data gets between here and there. The data that is behind all of the talking we're doing right now may be traveling anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter. All of those intermediate functions are subordinated to the need of all the ends to communicate. So let's go back to the web, which I illustrated that way earlier. This is what we thought the web was at first. When we first all got graphical browsers, those of us who had them in 1995, 1994, 95, Mosaic was invented in 94. Netscape came along in 95, so did Internet Explorer from Microsoft and a bunch of others. But we thought it was a library. It looked like a library. We had files that we put in folders and we could browse. And that, by the way, is a photo that I found in IU's own archives, and that's at the Wells Library in 1969. So that's what we thought it was. And the first company that really tried to take advantage of that was Yahoo, and it wanted to create a directory. Here's a directory, much like that card catalog, and we're going to have semi-permanent looking things in here that are, science and social science and health and so forth. And that's a lot of us thought we were making at that time. But what we got, to subtract an awful lot of history, is a haystack. And that haystack is this heaving heap of stuff that's largely live. And Google helps us find stuff in here. But they're basically creating an index of this haystack of all of the stuff it can find at all times on the web by using dozens of giant data centers that are keeping track of all this stuff. And they're doing it in close to real time, which is hard to imagine even when Google first came along. But that's what this is. We have this big heap. So I'm going to let, let's see if this is the last. Yeah, okay, I'm going to go back. So I'm going to punch out of this and let David take it from here with where his part of the discussion we had a few days ago. Where was the thing? There we go. Okay, David, you're on.
Okay. So I should share my screen, which I will do here, I think. Yeah. This technology should be a lot easier, but that's a different thing. And I'll go into slideshow mode here. Okay. So that should work. Maybe. Doesn't it? Doesn't matter if it doesn't, but people are seeing this.
Yes.
I wonder why I'm not in slideshow mode. Whatever. Huh. I guess I am. Okay. So I decided to, when talking to Doc about this, I decided it would be useful to point out that my perspective goes in a completely different direction on what's happened with the internet, and it starts out in a different place. I noticed Steve Crocker's on the call. Steve may or may not share this perspective, but we started working on the internet roughly the same time, give or take 5 years. And I don't know if other people see this, but when I first got into serious computing, I had been programming for 4 years before that, but doing stuff that would now be called climate modeling and so forth, which doesn't really focus on anything related to networks. in 1970, I joined this place called MIT Project Mac, and probably most people don't even know much about it unless they're in the computing field, but it was the center of, a great revolution in computing that was kicked off by time sharing. It was kicked off by J.C.R. Licklider, who can be thought of as one of the fathers of the internet, at least in a person who conceived it, like Paul Barron sort of did in their own image. And what Project Mac was about, if you sort of use modern terminology, is person-computer symbiosis. The idea back then, many people shared this vision of the future. Alan Kay described it as something called a Dynabook, which would enhance the power of humanity by essentially being something you could carry around with you. It's really, in some ways, the cell phone of its time, except it didn't do any telephony or anything like that. It was a concept. And the concept was that humans and computers would live together. That's what one of the meanings of Project Mac, which was man and computer, was what the acronym was for. Notice it's not about computer science. That term hadn't even been invented. But so I joined that, and there were about 25 major leading lights who were faculty and lead staff there, who basically were dedicating their lives in an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how humans and computers could make a symbiosis. And our computing engineering stuff was subservient to that. So this is the perspective of an engineer who thinks, an engineer who thinks of large systems, and in particular, the word person is at the center. What happened when networking came around, and there was the ARPANET and then the Internet project, was that that vision transformed itself a bit, and you might call the tradition I come from what might be a society computation symbiosis with networking enabling that. So the reason I bring that up will become clear, because this is very different from thinking about the internet as the web. Licklider talked originally, and this is what he and Bob Taylor kind of came up with, which inspired the whole ARPANET project, or actually the internet part of the ARPANET project kind of, was that the internet would be a network of networks, almost like that picture from Paul Barron of a decentralized system. But in fact, the way they talked about it, it was much more a network of networks of ends. And the whole point of this in a societal human symbiosis would be to do two things. One is to extend our reach and our cognition, so essentially our sensors and actuators of all the humans on the planet. And the other, which is deep, a deep part of what I've been doing for the last 50 years, is looking at how to facilitate coordination and cooperation. And this is, I think, what is hard for people who sort of come out of traditional American culture to understand. I think folks at the Ostrom Center understand this very deeply, that a major role of communications is for coordination and cooperation, not for satisfying individual needs, and not for just extending one person's reach and cognition, but extending society's reach and cognition. So I want to emphasize that, because that's been the part of the internet that I've been part of for the last 50 years. I was lucky to be to early on become one of the designers of the internet protocols. I got dragged in because at MIT I was focused on computer to computer communication, doing something called local area networks. But it wasn't so much that they were local, it was the fact that the dominant communication was between machines and not between humans. But I'm actually equally interested in humans and think of humans and machines in my own mind as largely interchangeable. Whereas most people at the time had come from the time-sharing system perspective, and in a time-sharing system perspective, and a lot of people who did the ARPANET were focused on this, was basically an idea of getting remote access to computers that were far away. So that, again, I come at this from a very different perspective, but I brought that perspective to the internet design because what we wanted to do was create an architecture that would support machine-to-machine communication, machine-to-human communication, and any mixture thereof. And you can trace, this isn't just my story. If you actually look at the history, you'll find an equal weight on that as remote login, which was, is often emphasized in more traditional histories of the origin of the internet. Now, what was interesting about the internet project as opposed to the ARPANET project was there was an essential requirement that the internet support autonomous networks, not just autonomous people or autonomous machines, but autonomous networks, networks that had no common governance, no common ownership, no common anything, but could still perform their role of communicating and cooperating, or assisting in communication and cooperation. And in a sense, what we came up with in the early design, it took a lot of iteration and a lot of discussion, was that in fact, what holds the internet together is cooperation. It's voluntary cooperation. The internet we have today still is built on voluntary cooperation. And that's a part of the foundation of the internet. It's as much a foundation as, for example, the definition of a bit, the shape of the packets, and so forth. The basic assumption is that there's cooperation, which doesn't mean we disregarded non-cooperation, but the core idea of the internet was to focus on cooperatively achieving planet-wide scale. So we took as our goal, it's kind of a research goal because nobody knew if you could do it. Our goal was to say, what can we do if there are no owners? If there's no higher authority, there's no governance. Strangely enough, and this surprised many of us, by the mid-90s, the thing we had started as just an experiment in design flourished anyway, partly because no one else built anything better, and partly because the attribute of having no owner is actually a really great feature. Again, maybe some folks at the Ostrom Center might have some abstract thoughts about that. But so I still am, over the last 50 years, I've constantly encountered people who say, okay, if you're going to design a system, first you got to have some manager on top. And the manager is going to specify what happens, and they're going to control what happens. They're going to be the central control. Even if, even in the case of Bitcoin, which is supposedly decentralized, there's actually one ledger and there's one manager, even though it's kind of a virtual manager, right? So the idea that you could have a system that survived and flourished with no manager, with no governance, was and is still very surprising to people. But it does work. So one of the side effects of this, and this is again my perspective, is that it maximized agency. And what I mean by agency is the flexibility. I mean, you could use the word freedom, but I'm going to try to avoid that term. Say it maximized flexibility and opportunity to arrange the communications you want to have in any way you want. that's a really good potential feature. It might also be a source of potential bugs. And really, the internet is aimed not at creating a library, not at information sharing, not at data processing, not at data at all. It's really focused on activity and coordination, as I said before, and extending reach. So one thing it provides is individual agency. We all individually, in the context of having an internet connection, have.
I realized while I'm listening to this, I could stand this.
I can hear you. Whispering person. The individual agency, and you also got group forming agency, which is something that I finally decided to talk a lot about because no one was talking about it. The reason this is interesting, I captured when I originally wrote and talked about Reed's Law. The whole point there is that communication often involves forming subgroups of the whole, and those subgroups can manage their own communications independently. They are not hierarchical descendants of a boss. They sometimes are facilitated by, some more powerful entity. But this is not the kind of agency that's in the First Amendment, only because, so freedom of speech and freedom of assembly seem analogous. But the reason this is not that is because there's no government. We needed the First Amendment to say, oh, even though there's a government, people have agency. I'm sorry, going forward. So what happened? And this is kind of covering the history starting around the 1990s, really, of what happened in the internet. I have friends at MIT Sloan School. I've worked with them. They worry about structuring businesses. And in business management, business strategy, there's a common term that refers to a business control point. Now, if you have a system that has no control points, what do you do? Well, the internet itself really still has no control points. That is the layer that facilitates the coordination and interoperation and so forth. But, as we saw, for example, with Google, we discovered that there are ways to construct new forms of enclosure. They succeeded in constructing that.
People are hogging all the.
Okay, I'll ignore the noise.
Steve Tulsky, can you?
I got up early, and then I had to leave to a call and back.
So anyway, so we have new forms of enclosure. I picked that term because we're at the Ostrom Center, and we find them in essentially network scaling laws. That's why Reed's Law is part of that. We find it in increasing returns economic structures. And generally, businesses have gotten really good at finding ways to enclose a space and dominate that function in the internet. Fortunately, they've never succeeded in creating protocols that technically require that enclosure. So it's a somewhat external form, but it's still part of the society. Remember, this is a symbiosis of society and computing. So we find those forms of enclosure largely driven by economic configuration. Now, I don't want to talk a lot about economics here other than hand wave. I've actually looked a lot at the economics, and I have friends who have studied it a lot too, the economics of the internet. But what I want to point out here is that in the internet, there is no necessity for that. You don't need to have a boss of the internet. This is something I've been trying to say for years, despite the fact that there are many internet governance activities. They're really not trying to govern the internet. They're trying to govern these control points that have spontaneously formed on the internet, but they think they need to control the technology in order to control the control points. And I dispute that. So let's look at this. The other thing that happened, and this happened maybe in the early 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, for the most part, is that originally, and the person who's written about this best, it's part of a chapter in Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. She talked about the fact that in the late 90s, early 2000s, many of us technologists were and many companies were very focused on enhancing the symbiosis between machines and networks and computers. For example, I remember Apple's Knowledge Navigator demo and so forth. Those have been around for a long time. I worked on at Interval Research. I worked on some far out ideas about connected wearable technology and so forth. But the goal there, and we all assumed that we were going to make the world better for the humans that inhabited it and society that inhabited it. But in fact, what we've gotten starting in the first decade of the 21st century is a better form of social control, as those who focus on the machines and the data as having value kind of start to disregard the people who are using the system and view the people as subjects or targets of their technology. And that's been it's been documented in various ways. The most obvious one is with Google, who decided that in order to support their fairly expensive search technology, they had to have some form of income, and they decided to do that via advertising. And then they learned that by personalizing advertising, they also needed to observe the users, not the customers. They observed the users and then could sell to the customers what might be called exhaust data, except it became worth more than any other kind of data, which is models of user behavior. So we ended up with social control. But again, have we lost the possibility of a better symbiosis? I don't think so. But right now, it's not looking like it's going in the right direction. So the other thing that happened at roughly the same time was that, and I won't blame him, but I'll just point out there was a book written by Chris Anderson titled Free, which basically identified the fact that on the internet, because there's so much auxiliary return, the best business model is to offer your service free and find some other way to make money. And that other way usually exploits a control point or two. So by giving stuff away for free, I mean, we all know this. I'm not telling you anything new, but I want to emphasize this. Jaron Lanier, by the way, has been emphasizing this a lot in talks he gives, if any of you have watched them recently. But the basic sin against the old goal of symbiosis was to basically turn the symbiont, the organizations that were providing interconnection services, into parasites. And they did that by offering free service that was too good to be true, getting so large that they were unreplaceable, and creating maybe the opposite of free in terms of agency of the individuals thus affected. I think this is a really important, it's a really important central big systems level picture of where we are. And what I'd really like to convey is that it doesn't have to be that way. This is not a techno inevitability story. It's a story that has been a struggle between competing interests. But the internet, as we originally conceived it, is still there. It's still highly flexible. It still has a lot of opportunity for agency. We haven't closed off the agency. We've just chosen not to build anything that provides it. So that's fascinating to me. I could go on and talk about privacy as how it relates to this, since privacy is a social good, not an individual good, and societies benefit from privacy. Yet we choose not to be private largely as individuals, and certainly our society does not choose privacy. But the point I want to make here is that the architecture is there to be exploited in a different way. But we really seriously need some demonstrations of an alternate view. And I think with that, I'm done, and I'm going to stop sharing and let Doc finish up here.
I have to go off mute myself. Thanks, David. That was fabulous. Somebody's already asking, how is privacy not an individual good? I don't think David's saying that exactly. It's a social good and an individual good. Anyway, we can talk about that. But I'm going to cut out a bunch of slides I was going to give and just jump, because I want us to have time to talk, and start here. Let me go to sharing the screen. I'll go to this one, share, and there it is. A friend of ours and a colleague, Phil Windley, who is a PhD computer scientist. He's at BYU. He's the former CIO of Utah, and he co-organizes the Internet Identity Workshop, which Isak mentioned earlier, a very active and successful workshop that happens twice a year. We just had our 33rd since 2005. Well, Phil has this history of e-commerce. He has it in one slide, and it goes like this: history of e-commerce, 1995, invention of the cookie, the end. It's like, that's kind of the way e-commerce has been looked at. Now, we added one more thing to this, which is surveillance capitalism. David talked about this. I just want to show you how bad it actually is. And there's a site I recommend going to called Page X-Ray. It's a really simple thing. It's by Fu Analytics, a computer scientist, also from MIT, Augustin Fu, friend of ours, lives in New York. He's got a great business in debunking so many claims made by the advertising world. But if you put he's got a form there, and you drop in something like I did here with Smithsonian Magazine. What your browser does when it goes to your website is it asks for a file. That's all it ever did in the first place. But what you get is this, not just a cookie, you get all this stuff. This is just a corner of it. This is just a corner of what comes back when you go to Smithsonian Magazine. Here on my 27-inch screen is the rest of it, and it's just massive. And we're up against this. This is normative to an extreme that the GDPR, the CCPA, and other things have not been able to crack. And I'm showing this mostly so we can look outside of this, because I think, as David just pointed out, the internet is gigantic and capable of supporting so many other forms of agency than we have so far. So this is the box we need to exit, and that's what the theme of this talk is about. Joyce and I have been working on something called the Byway, and we have a project on this. I'm not going to go into it. It's clever. We're going to talk about it here in the physical world, though it may go out to the rest of the world on November 9th. So there's a short link for that at the top, bypass big data, bit.ly.com, bypass big data. And somebody can put that in the chat as well. And these are, and I'll leave this here as some additional topics that when Joyce and David and I were talking a couple of days ago, they came up and did not fit in a slide. So, David, do you want to address any of these? Because microeconomies I rather like as a topic, and if you want to touch on those, then we can go to the questions and answers on the chat and just talk amongst ourselves here.
Sure, I'll say a couple things. I'm actually eager to engage with this lovely audience here. One of the things that's always struck me, and remember, I come at this from kind of an engineering perspective, but I don't mean an engineering of physical hard things. I mean, I include social engineering in that, positive social engineering. And, to me, an architect is somebody that designs spaces people have to live in. So what struck me as I build systems, and I build all kinds of systems still, I don't do as much talking about it, but building them, is that there's no particular reason for a single hierarchy. In fact, there's lots of reasons not to have a single hierarchical structure, even of economies. And if you look for a hierarchy, like people have been looking at the structure of the brain and keep finding hierarchies with some kind of control agent on top, which is called the self. Every time we dive deeper into the science, we discover that no, there isn't one of those. So in fact, we have microeconomies. The problem is we don't support them very well. Microeconomies are much more natural than command and control economies. That's hard to see in the U.S. because literally the politics of our country is structured around the idea that either the government or the bankers, depending on your pick, are in control of the economy. And in fact, we carry out, real microeconomies all the time. The question is, why don't we support those microeconomies on the internet? Because the internet's a perfectly good place to coordinate any subgroup. They don't have to be physically local to each other. They just need to be a group that needs to trade among themselves. So again, we could create rich, microeconomies, very much like the soil around trees in an ecology that would make economics work a lot better. And, I think we should question the reason why we think we need command and control in the economy. Regarding beefing up the middle class, I won't go that far. I've thought a lot about sociology, but, and socioeconomy. But I think, again, that's likely to be a side effect of an architecture that is much more flexible for society. And what I would like to comment on, because I mentioned it earlier, is that the notion of privacy has also gotten extremely narrow. We seem to talk, as computer scientists, we've convinced people that privacy is about data. And that comes from the idea that privacy is about secrecy or access control. But in fact, privacy has always been the right to be left alone. And the reason you leave people alone is so that they can have a private life. And I think that's, the internet creates vast opportunities to have private lives that are rich without intrusion. But, again, the architectures that we built on top of it seem to be anti being left alone. I don't understand individual psychology that leads people to think that the optimal society is one where everybody knows everybody else's business. But and in fact, they don't. Only Google knows all your business. But that's I think there's lots of opportunity here to rethink how we govern our society with the augmentation of networks rather than the other way around. So with that, let's
with that, we have, I think, and Angie, you can correct me on this. I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see each other in the big grid. We can go long if we have to. I know we we gave it an hour, but we can go longer if we wish, don't we? Can't we?
No.
Nope. Okay. Oh,
No.
yes. No? Okay.
Angie's saying no.
Angie says no, and she is the host. So, okay, anybody want to raise? Okay, Mark Carranza has his hand up, so, and we'll go with the hand thing. And most people don't know, the hand is hidden. They have to look for it, but it's there.
Hi, Angie, Doc, David, and Joyce. Could you talk about the next in the series, or at least make sure we talk about the next in the series before the end of the hour?
Okay.
I'll tell you quickly who we've I have a list of people that we're approaching, and I don't want to give away too much on that, but I would love to hear from Robin Chase, who is the creator of Zipcar and has talked about cooperation and has a lot to say about this. Ethan Zuckerman, who's at UMass Amherst now, he was a Berkman colleague, and he has a wonderful podcast called Reimagining the Internet. Joyce, you want to say any more about that? We've thought a lot about this. We don't have.
We have a wish list, and we will announce it as soon as we get sign up.
It's coming. TBD.
Yeah. But all on basically the same topic of beyond the web. What can we imagine? I mean, David has really laid the groundwork perfectly. Like the internet is, it's still wide open spaces. We don't have to live within the constructs of the big platforms. So anyway.
Yeah. So
David Mackey.
Yeah, David Mackey.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Angie, for putting this together. And really thank you for giving me an opportunity to ask a question to David Reed. It's I'm a geek. I'm a computer science guy from a long time ago. It's amazing. So let me go into the question. It truly is amazing to look back over 30, 40 years and to see what started as a technology to have an impact globally essentially on global human experience. That's not an understatement.
Right.
The question I have for you is, within that system, there is a human component and there is a technology component. The question I have for you falls on the technology component. And if you start with the base of the IP protocol, which I agree is very open at this point, there's nothing restricting us from building on top of it. But the question I have is it's a technology question. As you go up the stack above IP, and you get into something called TCP, and then above TCP, you end up with an HTTP protocol. In that space, on that particular layer of the stack, you eventually end up with a URI space or a URL space. Is there anything inherently wrong with using that URI space to develop distributed applications to address the human need? Does that question make sense?
Sure, it makes a lot of sense. The URI space, other people have commented on this as well. The URI space, which is the idea of a sort of a hierarchical name structure that you can essentially is rooted. There are a bunch of roots. You probably know all this, but there are a bunch of physical roots where roots meaning ROOT in this tree that are maintained at various places around the world and have a duplicate copy of essentially everything at the very base, and then the rest of it is decentralized in that term Paul Barron used. That's a very useful namespace. It was originally conceived by Tim Berners-Lee to be a wide open namespace, but he was convinced, and I think it was actually not a good choice, but as he tells me, he was convinced to use the domain name system for that namespace, for the base of that namespace. So that's where we have things like, read.com, which I used to have, but no longer have, and so forth, that, it was convinced to base URIs on that. But what's happened is that the gods of intellectual property, in particular trademark law, raised their heads and said, look, if people are using names, they have to follow trademark law. And there's been kind of a disaster as a result of that. I don't know if it could have been prevented, but what is going on is that there are various forms of alternative naming technology that work just as well within the internet, and we could always switch to one of them. IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, so-called, is developing an alternative naming system that is kind of forward compatible with the existing URLs. But even they don't have a monopoly on it. So we could create namespaces. But when you're working with a society, you can't dictate an answer, right? You basically have to get an answer that's adopted, and it's got to be adopted because it's useful, and it doesn't get globally adopted. It gets adopted and then grows, right? So I'm quite comfortable with the idea that initiatives to create a better naming space will naturally occur unless they're blocked from occurring. And there's always been a potential that the voluntary construction of the internet, voluntary cooperative construction of the internet, as I often say, the internet was built by its users, but some of the users are bigger than others. There's a point where voluntary cooperation can be, prevented, and governments sometimes have the power to do that. Corporate monopolies have the power to do that. Exploiting free has the power to do that. And so we see, and actually internet access technologies have the power to do that by blocking packets, So what I hope is that we will see invention of those, of a much better naming space, many more rich protocols, but the economies of scale and scale economies still play a role. And if we're going to succeed in that, you have to have a coordinated activity. So again, it requires cooperation. There's no government or God or, even the IATF can't force people to adopt the protocol.
Perfect. That answers my question.
We're really low on time here, David.
Okay.
David, I'm sorry.
I'm trying to get the gap. I'm trying to get the gap between what's possible on the technology side, and I know I don't want to go too far into the technology, but it's fair to say that there's some technology paths that can help the human aspects. Is that fair?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Okay. That's all.
I am very optimistic. There are plenty of paths left.
We have less than 5 minutes left. So, Maylin, you're first, and then Johannes. I think that may be all we have time for.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Joyce, for urging me to be here. And I just wanted to say, on the side of the people-centered internet, we are fully on board and hoping to work on this. However, I really was most encouraged to see the engagement with the Ostrom Workshop. And I think that the Eleanor Ostrom, the rules for radicals, the economic part of it has to be tightly integrated. And that's what I wanted to say. For going forward, the Ostrom Workshop should be far more involved than I see in this just hosting capability. That's my comment.
Well, we're just getting started, Maylin. But we totally believe it, exactly what you said. That's why we're doing it here. Thank you.
My turn? Yes, so thank you for the history lesson that we got here from some of the people who built this, among others. And it occurs to me, sort of reviewing this, that the internet, in a way, took a sharp right turn or left turn or some sharp turn somewhere around 2005, 10, somewhere around that, when the large platforms emerged. And there is good trends for why that happened, commercial kind of trends and so forth. My question is, what countervailing trends do you see that go away from the platforms, that go back to augmentation, that go back to the kind of collaborative scenarios we've been talking about here?
Well, Doc, it's worth pointing out that Doc's interest in forming the byway is an interesting one. I think we see on the side, we don't see, it's not celebrated in the venture capital community, but we see a lot of adoption of various kinds of internet-based technologies that, like Zoom, for example, although Zoom did make a lot of money. Zoom is a good start. What would be better for me, because Zoom seems to be slow at innovating, very slow at innovating, given the fact that it's taken the world by storm, is that there's nothing unique technologically about Zoom. There are much better ways to have this conversation, I'm sure, and I don't know why people aren't inventing them, other than the fact that Zoom is free again, which are essentially free. So I see the folks that are inventing these new conversational platforms as part of that future. There's an economic problem to solve here, which is, how do you compete against free?
Right. Steve, we have another. I think we have time.
Just before we jump to Steve, I'm mindful that some people may have wanted to jump off at 4. We'll stay on for a few minutes here. If anybody has more questions, I don't want to cut the conversation short. But just as for those of you who have to get off right at 4, Joyce pasted in the chat what we've scheduled for the coming months. So the next couple, keep an eye on your emails as we actually know who the guest will be and what the direction that will be going on in each of the individual talks. But that is on the 25th. That's today. Then we have the 15th of November, the 7th of February, 7th of March, and 11th of April. And so get those times down. They'll be at 3, and then after January they'll turn to 1. So for those who have to jump off, thank you for joining us. For those who still have questions, please stay on. We'll keep the room open to continue the conversation for a little bit here. To you, Steve.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. I'll be quite brief. Just 2 points. As is pointed out, there's a hierarchy of protocols and so forth, and all of that was envisioned from the beginning with the idea that you could build new applications. You don't have to stay within the stack, so to speak. You can go build off and take a right turn. You can take a left turn. You can even put things in between layers or on top, and so forth. So there's nothing in the technical sense that precludes building alternatives to what we currently have. That's one comment. The other comment is, the elephant, the horde of elephants, if you will, that are in the room, is that economics plays a huge role, and the economics is dollars, of course, but it's also the other measures of what costs of attention and just the learning curves and so forth. So you get services like Zoom, and once it is there, building a alternative is hard because it's got to be significantly better. I could try to make up the words, but you can fill in the rest of that. So I think we have to understand and accept and take advantage of the economic factors as opposed to just decrying them or ignoring them. Otherwise we're just going to, as academics like to say, just admire the problem, and we'll be stuck there.
Yeah, Steve, I would just add to that that something that makes a big difference in protocol space, this is a technical thing, is open protocols. All of the protocols that are actually defined by the IETF, anyone can use, and that doesn't cost them any money. They can use them. They expose internal interfaces. Back in the day when IBM was forced by antitrust law to expose the interfaces to the components of its systems, we got a rapid evolution of, mainframe computer technology. I think if you wanted to make it sort of focus on a technological change, publish all the protocols you use internally to systems would make a big difference, because then people could build on what's already out there. That may be very hard to happen. Usually it's reverse engineering that publishes the protocols these days.
Well, a fair point, but let me just sort of beat the same drum that I was beating before. Even with the open protocols in the IETF, which was how we started out, with the idea that everything would be open and published. It takes one hell of a long time to get a new protocol through the IETF these days. There is a lot of drag, and that drag is, maybe regrettable, but it also is inescapable. And I think you could probably predict from first principles that that's the way it would go as you scale up the system from a few hundred people to a few billion people working on this thing.
Yep.
The rant.
More conversation.
Cool. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
And with apologies, I do have to break off. Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve. Oh, we have a name. We have a Ward.
Oh, yes. I had a question for Mr. Searls. When you were getting into the whole writing about the tech and everything like that, coming of age and all that stuff, when Y2K was going on and all that kind of stuff, what were some of the thoughts that were going through your mind when all that was going on?
You're on mute. David.
Thanks, Ward. Just before Y2K, there was a group of us got together. Some of them may be here also. I know Joyce was there. Jeffrey, our son, was small. I remember that. We did it in Santa Cruz, and one of us did a 2x2 grid, which had social disruption on one axis and technical disruption on the other axis, and said, place your bets